Ethan Parker loved his quiet suburban home. As a city planner, he spent his career designing better communities, ensuring everything from roads to zoning laws made sense. But ironically, his biggest battle wasn't in the office. It was right outside his garage. The sun glinted off his prized Harley-Davidson as he tightened a bolt on the handlebars. He had worked for years to afford his dream bike, a symbol of freedom and craftsmanship. It was parked neatly in his driveway, not blocking the sidewalk, not disturbing anyone. Yet somehow, it had become the biggest scandal in the neighborhood. That's when he heard it, the distinct clack-clack of Karen Foster's heels against the pavement. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was notorious for her iron-fisted rule over the neighborhood. She was the type who measured grass length with a ruler and carried a clipboard like a sheriff's badge. She thrived on imposing ridiculous fines and bending the rules in ways that only benefited her. "Ethan," she greeted with a fake smile, arms crossed. "I see that thing is still here." Ethan glanced at his bike, then back at her. "You mean my motorcycle?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if he had just asked her to solve world hunger. "Yes, that. As I mentioned in last month's meeting, motorcycles are not in line with the aesthetic of our community." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And which rule says that?" Karen smirked, flipping through her binder. Article 4, Section 9. All vehicles must align with the neighborhood's character and not be a nuisance. He almost laughed. "Karen, that's vague at best. Character and nuisance are subjective terms. And considering half the neighborhood blasts leaf blowers at 7 a.m., I'd say this isn't the real issue." Karen's lips pursed. "The board has received complaints." "From whom?" Her hesitation was brief but noticeable. "That's confidential." Ethan sighed. "Karen, I'm a city planner. I literally write zoning laws. If there was a legitimate issue, I'd be the first to know. A motorcycle parked in a private driveway is not illegal." Karen's smug demeanor wavered before she regrouped. "Well, the HOA still has authority over community guidelines. If you don't comply, you'll be fined." "Fined for what?" She handed him a folded notice. He unfolded it and read. "Violation notice. Offense, unauthorized vehicle. Fine, $250. Ethan let out a slow breath, reminding himself not to laugh. "This is ridiculous." Karen smiled, the kind of smile that let him know she was enjoying this. "Rules are rules, Ethan." He met her gaze unwavering. "We'll see about that." As Karen strutted away, Ethan glanced at the paper again. The battle had begun, but Karen had no idea who she was messing with. HOA's first power move. The next morning, Ethan stepped outside to grab his mail, expecting nothing more than bills and junk flyers. Instead, he found an envelope taped to his front door. Another violation notice. He tore it open and read. Second notice, final warning. Offense, unauthorized vehicle, motorcycle. Fine, $500. Failure to comply will result in legal action and potential towing. Ethan exhaled sharply. So, Karen had decided to escalate. Shaking his head, he tucked the notice under his arm and walked to the curb, where his neighbor, Greg, was watering his lawn. "Let me guess," Greg said, nodding toward the envelope. "Queen Karen at it again? Apparently, my bike is now a capital offense." Greg chuckled. "She's gone after people for porch decorations, basketball hoops, and even flower colors. Nothing surprises me anymore." Ethan glanced down the street, where Karen's house sat like a self-proclaimed throne. She was standing on her porch, clipboard in hand, watching him like a hawk. She waved. He didn't wave back. Instead, he headed inside and did what he did best, research. Step 1. Check HOA bylaws. After scanning through pages of HOA policies, Ethan confirmed what he already suspected. Nowhere did it explicitly ban motorcycles. The vague neighborhood character clause Karen cited was subjective and unenforceable. Step 2. Check city ordinances. As a city planner, he knew that HOA rules couldn't override municipal law. His city had no restrictions on motorcycles in private driveways. Armed with knowledge, Ethan marched straight to the HOA office, where Karen was conveniently stationed behind the front desk. "Karen," he greeted coolly, dropping the notices onto the counter. "This fine is invalid." She didn't even look up. "You're in violation of HOA policy." "No," he corrected. "I'm in violation of your interpretation of the policy. But according to city code, my motorcycle is perfectly legal." Karen sighed and folded her hands. "Ethan, we have the right to enforce community standards. And I have the right to due process," he shot back. "If you tow my bike, that's vehicle theft." If you fine me for a rule that doesn't exist, that's fraudulent enforcement. And if you push this any further, I'll take it to the city council. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she covered it quickly. I'm just doing my job. That's funny, Ethan said, crossing his arms. Because your job is supposed to serve the community, not your ego. Her eyes narrowed. If you refuse to comply, we'll take further action. Ethan smirked. Go ahead. But I'd reconsider before making a legal mess you can't clean up. With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Karen fuming behind the desk. But he knew this wasn't over. And he was right. Later that evening, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a uniformed inspector from the city's code enforcement office standing on his porch. Mr. Parker? That's me. We received an anonymous complaint about a zoning violation on your property. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Anonymous, huh? He didn't even need to guess who was behind it. The inspector looked uncomfortable. Would you mind if I take a look around? Not at all, Ethan said, stepping aside. In fact, let me save you some time. He handed the inspector a copy of the zoning laws and his property rights, highlighted and tabbed for easy reference. The inspector skimmed through the pages and sighed. Yeah, this all checks out. There's no violation here. Thought so. Ethan crossed his arms. Just out of curiosity, did the complaint mention a motorcycle? The inspector hesitated before nodding. Ethan smirked. Tell Karen I said hi. The inspector chuckled. You have a good night, Mr. Parker. As the officer walked away, Ethan leaned against his doorframe, watching Karen's house across the street. She wanted a war? She just got one. The HOA escalates the conflict. Ethan had expected Karen to back down after the zoning inspector confirmed he wasn't violating any laws. He had underestimated her pettiness. The next morning, he found 3 new violation notices taped to his door. Notice of infraction. Unauthorized vehicle, motorcycle. $750 fine. Excessive noise violation, $500 fine. Improper storage of property, $400 fine. Ethan scoffed. Excessive noise? His bike hadn't even been running. And improper storage? It was parked in his own driveway. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to bleed him dry. He grabbed the papers and stormed to the HOA office. Karen was waiting for him, sipping coffee behind the desk like she'd been expecting this confrontation. Morning, Ethan, she said sweetly. Lovely day, isn't it? Cut the act, Karen, he snapped, slapping the notices onto the counter. Explain these. She picked up the papers, pretending to read them over like they weren't her own doing. Oh dear, multiple violations. That's quite serious. Ethan leaned in. We both know these are bogus. I'm not paying a cent. Karen sighed dramatically. Ethan, you have a choice. You can either comply like everyone else, or what? He interrupted. You'll make up more fake fines? Tow my legally parked vehicle? You're grasping at straws, and you know it. Karen's lips curled into a smug smile. It's funny you should mention that. The board just approved a motion to increase fines for repeat offenders. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You mean you approved it? She shrugged. Same thing. Ethan took a slow breath, keeping his anger in check. You're abusing your power, Karen. And it's going to bite you. Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice. That's cute, Ethan. But you see, I am the HOA. The board listens to me. And do you know why? She tapped her clipboard. Because I know how to make people comply. Ethan smirked. Then it's a shame you don't know how to follow the law. For the first time, Karen's confidence faltered. Ethan turned and walked out, but not before hearing her mutter, You'll regret this. Digging into HOA corruption. That night, Ethan did what he did best, investigate. He dug through old HOA meeting minutes, scanned financial reports, and compared fine distributions over the past 2 years. Patterns started emerging. Certain homeowners had mysteriously never been fined. Large sums of money had been collected in penalties, but only a fraction was documented in HOA expense reports. Multiple payments labeled as board donations had been made to Karen's personal account. Well, Ethan thought. Looks like someone's been pocketing extra cash. The HOA board starts questioning Karen. Armed with evidence, Ethan started making calls to HOA board members. Most of them were hesitant to talk, but one, David, a newer member, agreed to meet. Over coffee, David sighed. Look, man, I don't agree with everything Karen does. But she runs this place like a dictatorship. Anyone who speaks against her gets targeted. She's stealing from homeowners, Ethan said, sliding the financial reports across the table. And if we expose this, she goes down. David studied the papers, his face tightening. I had a feeling something was off, but this is worse than I thought. Ethan leaned forward. Are you willing to help me take her down? David hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah, someone needs to put an end to this. Ethan smirked. Then let's get to work. Karen had declared war. But she had no idea Ethan had already started building his army. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, but even he was surprised at how far she was willing to go. It started early in the morning. He stepped outside to grab his newspaper when he noticed a tow truck idling at the end of his driveway. A man in a reflective vest was walking toward his motorcycle, clipboard in hand. Ethan's gut tightened. Oh, hell no. He jogged over, planting himself between the tow truck driver and his Harley. Can I help you? The driver barely looked up. HOA reported this vehicle as an unauthorized nuisance. Got an order to remove it. Ethan crossed his arms. Did you verify that order with the city? The man hesitated. No. HOA contracts us for removals. Ethan pulled out his phone. Then you're about to make a very expensive mistake. He dialed the non-emergency police line and, as it rang, gestured toward the driver. Touch my property, and I'll have you charged with theft. The man paled. Whoa, I'm just doing my job. Then do it right, Ethan said, showing the city zoning ordinance on his phone. This motorcycle is legally parked. HOA rules don't override municipal law. Just then, Karen appeared, marching over with that all-too-familiar smug expression. Ethan, you're making a scene, she scolded. I'm stopping you from committing a crime, he shot back. Karen's smile didn't falter. The HOA has authority over all community guidelines, including vehicle removals. Not without due process, Ethan countered. And not when the order is illegal. Before Karen could argue, the tow truck driver held up his hands. Lady, I'm not getting involved in this. If the city says it's legal, I'm not towing it. Karen's face turned beet red. You have a contract with us. And I have a license I don't want revoked, the driver muttered, heading back to his truck. Ethan smirked. Looks like you just lost, Karen. But she wasn't done yet, exposing the HOA's corruption. Later that day, Ethan gathered all the evidence he and David had compiled. Karen's financial mismanagement, fraudulent fines, and abuse of power, and took it straight to the city council. By the time he left the meeting, city officials were already drafting an investigation order. But Ethan wanted Karen to know exactly what was coming. That evening, he attended the HOA's monthly board meeting. The community center was packed, more than usual. Word had spread about Karen's latest antics, and homeowners were growing restless. Karen sat at the front, all smiles as she tapped her gavel. All right, let's begin. Ethan stood up. Actually, I have a few things to share. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're not on the agenda. Funny, Ethan said, pulling out a thick folder. Neither is embezzlement, but we're talking about that anyway. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen stiffened. Excuse me? Ethan held up the documents. These are financial records showing how HOA funds have been mishandled. Thousands of dollars in unaccounted fines, money that never made it to community improvements. David stood up beside him, holding more evidence. And here's proof that Karen has been personally approving fraudulent violations to boost HOA revenue. Gasps filled the room. Karen's face turned ghostly pale. That's ridiculous. You can't just make baseless accusations. Ethan stepped forward, voice calm but firm. That's why I already handed everything over to the city. They'll be launching a formal investigation. Karen shot up from her chair. This is slander. Ethan smirked. Then sue me. Silence. Karen looked around desperately, but no one came to her defense. Even the other board members shifted uncomfortably. The tide had turned. Karen wasn't just losing control. She was losing everything. Karen's final, desperate move. Karen was cornered. Ethan knew it. The board knew it. And judging by the way she stormed out of the meeting, she knew it too. But instead of backing down, she did what desperate people always do. She doubled down. Karen's last stand. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find something strange. His utilities had been shut off. No electricity. No water. He checked with the city, but there were no outages reported. That's when his phone buzzed with a message from David. David, dude, I just overheard Karen bragging about making your life very inconvenient. Check your water main. Ethan's jaw tightened. Sure enough, when he checked his property's utility box, he found that the HOA had tampered with it. placing a private HOA lock on his meter, effectively cutting off his water supply. This was illegal. Beyond illegal. It was utility tampering, a criminal offense in the city. And Karen had just handed Ethan the final piece of evidence he needed to destroy her. Catching Karen in the act. Instead of immediately calling the authorities, Ethan decided to wait. Because he knew Karen wouldn't stop there. He installed security cameras around his property and waited for her to make her next move. It didn't take long. That night, at around 2 a.m., a shadowy figure crept onto his property. Karen, clipboard in hand, she snuck onto his porch and began taking photos, probably to fake another violation. But then she did something truly stupid. She pulled bolt cutters from her bag and tried to break into Ethan's electrical panel. Bingo. The next morning, Ethan downloaded the security footage and drove straight to the police station. When he arrived, the officer on duty barely glanced up. "What can I do for you?" Ethan slid the USB drive across the desk. "I have footage of my HOA president trespassing on my property and tampering with my utilities. Pretty sure that's a felony." That got the officer's attention. Within hours, a warrant was issued for Karen's arrest. The moment of justice. That evening, the neighborhood gathered for an emergency HOA meeting. Everyone knew something was about to go down. Karen, still clueless about what was coming, stood at the front of the room. "Before we begin," she announced, "I have an important notice." She never got to finish that sentence. Because right at that moment, 2 police officers walked into the room. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Karen Foster?" Karen blinked, confused. "Yes. You're under arrest for trespassing, utility tampering, and fraudulent HOA enforcement." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face drained of all color. "This is insane. You can't." The officer pulled out the security footage. "We have video proof." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Then, as the officers cuffed her, the room erupted into applause. Karen had spent years bullying homeowners. Now, she was getting a taste of her own medicine. And Ethan? He just sat back, arms crossed, watching karma do its thing. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. Karen Foster, the once untouchable queen of the HOA, had been hauled away in handcuffs in front of the entire community. But the fallout was just beginning. The HOA starts to unravel. The morning after Karen's arrest, Ethan walked out onto his porch, coffee in hand, and took in the most glorious sight. Neighbors standing in their driveways, ripping up HOA violation notices. Greg, the guy next door, waved his crumpled paper in the air. "You see this, Ethan? No way I'm paying this bogus fine now." "You never had to," Ethan called back with a smirk. A few houses down, a family reinstalled the basketball hoop Karen had forced them to take down. Another neighbor was painting their front door, a color that had previously been banned. The neighborhood was waking up. People who had once lived in fear of Karen's ridiculous rules were finally realizing that her reign of terror was over. And at the center of it all, Ethan. The HOA board turns on Karen. That afternoon, an emergency board meeting was called to address the chaos. Ethan didn't have to go, but he wouldn't have missed it for the world. David stood at the front, shuffling through papers. "Given the circumstances," he began, "we need to discuss the immediate future of the HOA." One of the older board members sighed. "We can't keep ignoring it. Karen abused her power, not just with fines, but with finances." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. David cleared his throat. "The city's financial audit is already underway. If we don't act now, we could be held accountable too." "Then let's vote," someone suggested. "Karen's officially out." A unanimous yes echoed through the board. Karen was stripped of her position, her HOA privileges revoked, and her name blacklisted from ever holding authority in the community again. But it got better. Karen loses her home. A week later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. Ethan almost couldn't believe it. The woman who had tried to control everyone else's property was being forced to leave her own. Greg came jogging over, grinning. "You see that? The mighty Karen Foster is moving out." Ethan chuckled. Guess she couldn't handle living in a rule-free neighborhood. Word on the street was that Karen had no choice but to sell. Between legal fees, HOA fines, and city penalties, she couldn't afford to stay. And the best part, the person buying her house was a biker. Life had a funny way of coming full circle. The final victory. A week later, as Ethan sat on his porch, watching the moving truck haul away the last remnants of Karen's rule, he heard footsteps. David sat down beside him, handing over a cold beer. Hell of a thing you did, man. Ethan took a sip and smirked. Someone had to. David exhaled. With Karen gone, the HOA's future is up in the air. Some folks want to dissolve it completely. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And you? David grinned. I think we need a new president. Ethan chuckled. Don't look at me. David shrugged. Just think about it. No one knows HOA rules better than you. Ethan glanced around the neighborhood. People chatting in their driveways, kids playing outside, no one living in fear of another Karen tantrum. For the first time in years, it actually felt like home. Maybe, just maybe, he'd stick around to make sure it stayed that way. The HOA faces full legal consequences. With Karen out of the picture, Ethan thought the storm had passed. But the real damage was just beginning. The HOA faces the law. A week after Karen's departure, city officials launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's finances. And what they found? Fraud. Embezzlement. Dozens of homeowners had been forced to pay bogus fines. Money that never went to community improvements. Instead, it had been quietly funneled into Karen's personal accounts. The city council wasted no time in taking action. A massive fine was slapped on the HOA for violating homeowners' rights. Several board members resigned, fearing legal repercussions. Karen's bank accounts were frozen, pending a full investigation. And then came the final nail in the coffin. The HOA is dissolved. A petition to disband the HOA entirely had been making its rounds through the neighborhood. Ethan didn't start it, but he was more than happy to sign it. Within days, over 80% of homeowners had added their names to the list. At the next meeting, the remaining board members had no choice but to face the truth. This HOA is beyond repair, David admitted. If the majority wants out, we should respect that. A final vote was cast. And just like that, the HOA was officially dissolved. No more unfair fines. No more ridiculous rules. No more Karens trying to run the show. Ethan's final power move. As the meeting ended, Ethan stood up, clearing his throat. I have one last piece of business, he said, pulling out a massive stack of Karen's violation notices. Then, with the entire neighborhood watching, he tossed them into a metal trash can and set them on fire. Cheers erupted. Greg clapped him on the back. That's one hell of a mic drop, man. Ethan smirked. Figured it was time to clean house. And with that, Karen's reign was officially erased from history. Karen's personal downfall. With the HOA gone and Karen booted from the neighborhood, Ethan figured he'd heard the last of her. But karma wasn't quite done yet. Karen's reputation in shambles. A month after Karen moved out, Greg sent Ethan a link to a local news article. Former HOA president faces fraud investigation. Ethan smirked as he skimmed the article. Karen had tried to appeal the massive fines the city slapped on her, only to be hit with even more legal trouble. Her bank accounts were frozen, her credit destroyed, and rumor had it she was drowning in legal fees. And the cherry on top? She had been blacklisted from every HOA leadership position in the county. Karen's new job? One day, Ethan was grabbing coffee when he spotted a familiar face, Karen, standing behind the counter of a local property management office. Oh, this is too good. As he approached, Karen's eyes widened in horror. Ethan, she said stiffly. Karen, he greeted, barely hiding his grin. Didn't expect to see you here. She bristled. It's just temporary. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So, you went from running an HOA to working for a property management company? She clenched her jaw. I don't need your pity. He chuckled. Oh, trust me, I'm fresh out of that. Karen glared, but she knew she had lost. For years, she had bullied homeowners, acting like she was untouchable. Now, she was stuck filing paperwork for the very type of people she used to control. And that was poetic justice. Epilogue and final mic drop. The neighborhood felt different now. Without Karen's constant surveillance, people were relaxing for the first time in years. The basketball hoops were back up. Driveways had motorcycles, classic cars, and even an RV. Someone even put up Christmas lights in the middle of summer, just because they could. Ethan sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching it all with satisfaction. Greg strolled over, holding a piece of paper. You're gonna love this. He handed it to Ethan. It was a mock violation notice. Infraction, being too damn right all the time. Fine. 1 beer, payable immediately. Ethan laughed and shook his head. Guess I'll have to pay up. Greg cracked open 2 beers and handed one over. To a Karen-free life. They clinked bottles. And just like that, the nightmare was officially over. Karen was gone. The HOA was dead. And the neighborhood? It finally felt like home again.